The wind carried dust through the wooden slats of the small frontier town, rattling the loose shutters and tugging at the brim of a lone rider's hat. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour when the sun dipped low enough to paint everything in shades of gold, yet left long shadows stretching across the dirt street. The town wasn't more than a handful of buildings, a general store, a saloon, a smithy, and a church whose steeple leaned slightly, like it had long grown weary of pointing toward heaven. Folks here lived hard, scraping their survival from the dry earth, bartering more often than buying, and praying for rain as much as for mercy. The rider dismounted outside the store, boots stirring up a small cloud of dust when they hit the ground. He was a rancher, though no one needed to be told. His weather-worn coat, sunburnt skin, and the calloused hands that held the reins all spoke of a life lived under open skies, among cattle and endless fields. He carried himself with a quiet steadiness, not the kind of man who sought attention, but the kind who couldn't step into a place without being noticed anyway. He pushed through the door of the store, the creak of the hinges blending with the faint jingle of the bell above, inside. The cool air smelled of flour, tobacco, and kerosene oil. Shelves lined with jars and sacks promised the bare necessities of life. Behind the counter, the shopkeeper counted coins, while in the corner a mother stood with her child. She looked tired, too young to be carrying the weight she bore, yet her posture gave her away. The lines on her face weren't carved by age, but by grief and worry. She held a baby close, wrapped in a thin blanket that had clearly seen better days. The rancher paused, watching as the woman reached into her shawl and pulled out that same blanket, the only shield between her baby and the chill of the nights. She laid it gently on the counter and asked in a soft voice if it might be enough for a loaf of bread. Her words trembled not with pride, but with desperation. The shopkeeper hesitated, his eyes darting to the child in her arms, before finally nodding and reaching for the bread. The rancher's chest tightened. He knew that hunger well, the kind that drove people to trade away things they never should. He had seen neighbors give up land, horses, even wedding bands to keep from starving. But there was something about this woman's face, something in the way she cradled her child with every ounce of protection she could muster, that struck him deeper than he cared to admit. He could see it wasn't just food she needed, it was dignity, hope, a reminder that life wasn't finished kicking up dust in her direction. He stepped forward, the sound of his spurs drawing both the shopkeeper's and the widow's eyes. Without a word, he removed his hat and placed it gently on the counter. It wasn't an ordinary gesture. In these parts, a man's hat was more than shade from the sun. It was his mark, his shield, his pride. To set it down in front of someone was to say, "I see you. I'll stand for you." The room seemed to grow still, the kind of silence that holds its breath, waiting to see what happens next. The woman blinked at the hat, confusion and unease flickering in her eyes. She shifted the baby in her arms, her instinct telling her that charity often came with hidden costs. But the rancher didn't press. He didn't speak promises or demand thanks. He just let the hat sit there, solid and unshakable, like a wall between her and the harshness of the world. His gaze softened, though, and in that quiet moment, something passed between them unspoken. Fragile but real. The shopkeeper cleared his throat, torn between his ledger and the scene unfolding in front of him. The widow's fingers tightened around the loaf of bread, and for a moment it looked as though she might cry, though she held it back with the same iron will that had kept her upright through everything else life had stolen from her. She glanced at the door as though wondering if she should just walk away, take her bread and child, and pretend this moment had never happened. But the rancher stayed where he was. Not moving, not pressing, only waiting. The sound of a wagon rolling by outside drifted in, the slow clop of hooves echoing against the boardwalk. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Inside, the widow's heart pounded, her mind racing faster than she could catch it. Why would a man she didn't know lay down his pride for her? What did it mean? And what would it cost her to pick it up? The baby stirred in her arms, letting out a soft cry that broke the heavy silence. She hushed the child, her voice trembling as she whispered comfort, though her own soul felt anything but steady. Slowly, her eyes returned to the hat on the table. Resting there like a question she didn't know how to answer, the rancher finally spoke. His voice low, carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much, yet still believed in decency. No one should have to trade a blanket for bread. That was all he said. But it was enough. The widow swallowed hard, her throat tight, torn between pride and survival. She wanted to refuse to tell him she didn't need his pity. But deep down, she knew it wasn't pity. It was something different, something she hadn't felt in a long time, someone standing beside her without asking for anything in return. Her hand hovered over the hat, trembling as though it might burn her to touch it. She looked up at the man, searching his face for answers. And in that moment, the weight of the world seemed to balance on the edge of her decision. Would she take his silent offering? Or would she walk away with only bread in her hands and pride in her heart? The air between them thickened with the tension of it, as though even the walls of the little store leaned closer to see what she would do. And then, just as her fingers brushed against the brim of the hat, the door creaked open behind her, the sudden sound splitting the moment in two. She froze, clutching her baby tighter, while the rancher's eyes shifted toward the entrance. Whoever had walked in had just changed everything. The story had only begun. The door of the store creaked wider, letting in a streak of sunlight that cut across the floorboards. The widow didn't turn right away. She held her child closer, as though the mere sound of someone stepping inside made her guard rise even higher. The rancher shifted slightly, his hand resting on the counter near his hat, though his posture stayed calm. Whoever had entered wasn't just another customer. Both he and the widow seemed to sense it. Bootsteps echoed against the wood, slow and heavy, the kind that carried weight beyond the sound. The shopkeeper straightened quickly, his eyes darting to the newcomer. A man stood in the doorway, dust clinging to his boots, his broad shoulders framed by the light behind him. His hat shadowed much of his face, but his voice carried sharp when he finally spoke. "Didn't reckon I'd find you here?" The widow stiffened, every muscle in her back tightening as though bracing for a blow. She turned slightly, just enough to look over her shoulder. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The child whimpered, sensing the shift in the air. The rancher, standing a few paces away, studied her reaction carefully, the crease of concern etching deeper across his brow. The man stepped further into the store, the door falling shut behind him with a thud. He gave a glance at the rancher, a quick measuring look, then back at the widow. His presence alone seemed to fill the space, making the little store feel smaller, tighter. The widow finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you, I can manage on my own." There was history there, heavy, unspoken, and dangerous. The rancher didn't interrupt, but he didn't look away either. He knew enough about life in these parts to recognize when trouble had walked through the door. The shopkeeper pretended to busy himself with the coins, but his hands fumbled, and it was clear he didn't want to be caught in whatever was brewing. The man's eyes dropped to the loaf of bread in the widow's hand, then to the blanket lying folded on the counter. His jaw tightened. "Trading your baby's blanket now? That's what it's come to?" His tone wasn't kind, but it wasn't mocking either. It was the voice of someone caught between anger and regret. The widow's cheeks flushed with heat, and she drew her child closer, rocking gently, as though to shield the little one from the weight of the man's words. "It's none of your concern," she answered. Though her voice shook, the rancher finally spoke, his voice steady, carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be forced. "She's got a right to feed her child without being cornered for it." He didn't raise his tone, but the words carried all the same, firm as stone. The man turned, studying him fully now. Silence stretched between them, two men sizing one another in the middle of a town where reputation often outweighed law. The widow stood trapped between the past that had just walked through the door and the present that stood beside her. Hatless but unyielding, the baby let out another cry, breaking the moment, and the widow quickly soothed the little one. Her own heart beat loud in her ears. She could feel the tension climbing higher, like a storm gathering before the sky finally breaks. The man finally looked away, his eyes settling on the door as though he'd decided not to press whatever words had been burning on his tongue. "You'll find it's not so easy to manage alone," he muttered before pushing the door open again. The light swallowed him as quickly as he'd arrived, leaving only dust swirling in the air behind him. The widow's shoulders sagged, her knees nearly buckling from the strain of holding herself upright. The rancher reached for his hat but didn't put it on. Instead, he let it rest in his hands, his gaze steady on her. She didn't look back right away. Her eyes were fixed on the loaf of bread, on the small, ordinary thing that had nearly torn open old wounds right there in front of strangers. When she finally raised her head, she met the rancher's eyes. There was no pity in his look, only a quiet kind of respect. That made it harder somehow. Pity she could push away, but respect cut straight to the heart. The shopkeeper cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Best you take the bread," he said softly. "It won't keep long." His words were practical, but his face showed the weight of what he'd just witnessed. The widow took the loaf, her fingers brushing against the coarse crust, and nodded once in thanks. She turned to leave, shifting her child against her hip. But before she reached the door, she paused, her eyes flicking to the hat still in the rancher's hand. For a heartbeat, it seemed like she might say something. But instead, she stepped outside into the fading light. Her figure framed by the glow of the setting sun, the rancher stood still, the brim of his hat pressed between his fingers. He felt the echo of her presence even after she'd gone. Something about her, something about the way she'd clutched her child, lingered in his mind like a tune that wouldn't stop playing. He set the hat back on his head and finally stepped outside himself. The late-day breeze brushing past him. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that held more secrets than peace. He watched her walking down the street, bread in one hand, child in the other. She didn't look back. She walked with determination. Yet the weight of her loneliness was plain in the slope of her shoulders. The rancher turned toward his horse, tying the reins loosely as he mounted up. He didn't follow her, but his eyes lingered on the road she'd taken. Somewhere inside him, he knew this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. He nudged his horse forward, riding slowly through the heart of the little village. Children darted across the street, chasing each other barefoot, while an old man sat outside the saloon, strumming a guitar that had only 3 strings left. Life in the town went on, but underneath the surface, the rancher sensed the undercurrent of hardship that tied them all. Together, he thought of the widow, how desperation had pushed her to trade the only blanket she had for her child. He thought of the man who had come into the store, his sharp words and unfinished business hanging in the air. And he thought of his own life, the quiet solitude of the ranch where the cattle grazed under wide skies but left little company. For a man to keep, the sun sank lower, turning the horizon into a blaze of orange and crimson. The rancher rode toward the edge of town, but his thoughts circled back, restless, unfinished. He had no answers, no clear path forward, but something told him the story of the widow was far from over, and that somehow, whether he meant to or not, he was now part of it. Night would soon cover the village, and with it would come questions left hanging. Shadows stretching longer than the day had allowed. The widow would return to her small cabin, the baby tucked close, the bread divided carefully to last as long as possible. The man who had confronted her would not be gone for good. His return had stirred something that couldn't easily be buried again in the rancher. Silent under the vast sweep of the stars, would lie awake longer than usual, wondering what it meant when a man's hat found itself on a widow's table, and whether some burdens were meant to be carried alone or shared. No matter the cost, the road ahead promised no easy answers, only the slow unraveling of lives bound by hunger, pride, and secrets. And for now, that tension hung like a storm on the horizon. Waiting for its moment to break, the night settled heavy over the valley. The kind of darkness that swallowed sound and made every creak of a floorboard or rustle of wind feel louder than it should. The widow sat in her cabin, a single lantern burning low on the table, its light flickering against the rough-hewn walls. Her baby slept wrapped in her arms, but she couldn't rest. The loaf of bread, now half gone, sat on the counter beside a chipped plate. She stared at it, guilt gnawing at her as fiercely as hunger once had. Trading away the blanket had been a choice she hadn't wanted to make. But there hadn't been another. Her thoughts kept circling back to the rancher. The way he had set down his hat calm, steady, without asking anything in return, made her uneasy. Not because she distrusted him, but because kindness was harder to bear than cruelty. Cruelty was familiar. Kindness demanded trust, and trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Yet she couldn't push away the image of his face, or the sound of his voice when he told her no one should have to trade a blanket for bread. Outside, a wolf howled from the hills, its cry carrying across the open land. She pulled the baby closer, heart quickening. The sound reminded her of how fragile life was out here, how easily it could be taken away by hunger, sickness, or men with their own unfinished claims. She thought of the man who had walked into the store, the one who had looked at her like a shadow from her past. His words had cut deep, sharper than any blade. He hadn't said everything, but he'd said enough. He wasn't finished with her. At the same hour, the rancher lay awake in his bunkhouse on the edge of his land. The cattle were penned, the horses settled, but his mind wandered far from the fences and fields. He thought of the widow's face in the dim store light, of the way she had stood her ground even when her voice trembled. He wondered who the man was that had come looking for her and what kind of claim he thought he had. The rancher wasn't one to step into another person's business, but something about this felt different. Maybe it was the child. Maybe it was the way she had looked at the bread, like it was both salvation and shame. Sleep never came easy when the past stirred. He had his own ghost memories of a younger brother lost in a winter storm, of a ranch nearly taken by debt, of nights when the sound of cattle bawling in the dark meant a rustler's hand was close. He knew hardship, but what he saw in her eyes had been more than hardship. It had been isolation, the kind that cut deeper than hunger. Morning came with pale light creeping across the plains. The widow rose early, as she always did, though her body begged for rest. She gathered water from the well, her hands stiff from the cold. Each movement was quiet, careful not to wake the baby. Her cabin was small, built by rough boards that let in drafts no matter how she tried to patch them. The bread was already half gone, and she knew it wouldn't last another day. That thought pressed on her harder than any storm cloud. In town, whispers had already started. Folks had seen the rancher put down his hat for her, and in a place where every gesture meant something, it stirred talk. Some said it was just kindness, a man stepping in where he saw a need. Others thought it might mean more, that the rancher had laid some unspoken claim, or at least showed interest where no one else had dared. The shopkeeper kept his lips tight, but even he couldn't keep from glancing at the empty spot on the counter where the hat had rested. By noon, the rancher rode back into town for supplies. He tied his horse outside the smithy and stepped into the street, his eyes catching the widow walking with her child wrapped tight against her chest. She didn't see him at first, her focus on the ground. Her steps hurried like someone who wanted to move through the world unnoticed. But when she did look up, her gaze caught his for a fleeting moment. Neither spoke, but the silence between them said more than words could. She turned away quickly, heading down the road toward the church. Her figure small against the wide sky. The rancher's jaw tightened. He wasn't sure if she wanted distance, or if she simply didn't know what to do with what had happened between them. Either way, he felt the pull to follow, though he forced himself to stay where he was. It wasn't his place to press, but someone else had no hesitation pressing. The man from the store-dark hat, sharp words rode into town later that afternoon. His presence was like a gust of cold air sweeping through. He stopped at the saloon first, tying his horse loosely before stepping inside. He asked questions, quiet but pointed, and before long, half the men at the bar knew he was looking for the widow. He spoke of her as though she owed him, though he never said for what. The bartender listened, but kept his thoughts to himself. Word traveled fast in small towns. By evening, the rancher heard about the man asking questions, and it set his gut on edge. He didn't like mysteries that circled women with children in their arms. He didn't like the way the man's tone was described, part anger, part claim. It smelled like trouble, and trouble had a way of spreading wider than anyone wanted, the widow. Meanwhile, sat in the back of the church, the baby quiet in her lap. The preacher spoke about endurance, about faith in times of drought and famine, but her mind wandered. Every word of Scripture felt like an echo against her fears, not an answer. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going this way. The bread was gone now. Tomorrow would mean facing the same hunger, the same desperate choices. Her mind kept circling back to the hat on the counter. What had it meant? Was it simply kindness, or something more? Could she risk trusting it? The preacher's words faded into silence, and the congregation filed out into the fading light. She stayed seated, her child stirring softly. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the future pressing hard, when a shadow fell across the pew. She opened her eyes and found the rancher standing there, hat in hand again, his expression steady but unreadable. "I can help," he said simply, his voice carrying the same quiet strength it had in the store. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The words tangled in her throat. Help was dangerous. Help could bind her in ways she couldn't escape. But his tone carried no demand, no bargain. It was just an offer. Before she could answer, the church doors opened wide. The man from before stepped inside, his boots echoing loud against the wooden floor. His eyes landed on her, then flicked to the rancher. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The widow's heartbeat thundered in her ears. The rancher stood tall, his hat resting against his chest, his other hand hanging loose near his side. The man's gaze darkened, and in that moment, the air was filled with more than just tension. It was filled with the promise of reckoning. The baby whimpered, breaking the silence, and the widow clutched the child tighter. Her eyes darted between the two men, her body trembling with the knowledge that no matter what happened next, nothing about her life would remain untouched. The rancher didn't speak. Not yet. The man didn't move, but his presence filled the church like a storm cloud. The widow sat frozen, trapped between past and present, fear and the faint spark of hope she hadn't asked for, and as the lanterns flickered against the walls of the church, the question hung unspoken in the air. What price would be paid before this was over? And who among them would have the strength to bear it? The church was quiet, too quiet. It's only the faint hiss of the lanterns and the soft sound of the baby's breath breaking the silence. The widow sat frozen in the pew, her arms wrapped tight around her child, as though her very hold might shield the little one from what was coming. The rancher stood only a step away, his figure steady and rooted like an oak that had weathered storms before. Across from him, the man who had entered now stood just inside the doorway. The late evening light at his back, his face set hard as stone. The air between them was thick with something unspoken. None of them moved at first, and it was the kind of stillness that wasn't calm but coiled, ready to snap. The widow's heart raced, her eyes darting between the two men. The rancher's voice came low, controlled, a man's voice who didn't believe in wasting words. "This isn't the place for whatever you came to finish." The man gave a sharp smile, one that never touched his eyes. Every place is the right place when someone owes a debt. His gaze flicked to the widow, cutting into her, as if she were less a person and more a weight dragging at his boots. She flinched, though she didn't lower her chin. Her baby stirred, letting out a faint cry. The sound seemed to tighten every line of her face. The preacher, standing near the front, cleared his throat nervously. "Gentlemen, this is the Lord's house," but he stopped himself, his voice faltering as the man's eyes swept over him like a warning. The preacher stepped back, clutching his Bible to his chest. Unwilling to step into the storm that was building, the rancher shifted. His shoulders broad, his hat still clutched against his chest. He didn't raise his hand, but the way he stood carried its own kind of warning. "She doesn't owe you enough to bring your fight here," he said. Each word steady, measured, like bullets he didn't need to fire yet. The widow's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to say something that might end this without sparks turning into fire, but her tongue felt heavy. The man who had once been part of her past, who had now forced his way back into her present, didn't take his eyes off her. "You think you can walk away from what's owed?" he asked, his voice rough, bitter. "You think kindness will keep you fed or keep wolves from your door?" She clutched the child closer, tears stinging the edges of her eyes, though she fought to keep them from falling. "I've done what I can," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry wood. "I don't have more to give." The man's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, the rancher stepped forward, closing the space between them by a pace. It wasn't a challenge spoken outright, but it was clear as daylight. Two men now stood within reach of one another, the widow caught in the middle of the weight of their stares. The man's eyes narrowed, flicking briefly to the rancher. "You don't know what you're stepping into," he muttered. "She's not your concern." The rancher's gaze didn't waver. "Seems to me she is, seeing as no one else bothered to stand with her." The words hung heavy, echoing against the wooden walls of the church. The widow's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream at them both, to tell them this wasn't what she needed, that what she needed was peace. A way to keep her child safe without men drawing lines in the sand over her head. But the words stuck, trapped beneath years of carrying burdens alone. The man's fists clenched at his sides, tension rolling through him like a gathering storm. He took a half-step closer, his voice dropping into something lower, darker. "You think one hat on a table makes you her savior? You don't know the half of it." The rancher didn't flinch. His voice, quiet but unyielding, cut through the thick air. "Then tell me the half I don't know." The widow felt the blood drain from her face. Secrets she had carried like stones pressed hard against her chest, threatening to spill if this went any further. Her grip on her child tightened, the baby's tiny hand resting against her neck. She wanted to stop this, but she also knew once the truth started, it couldn't be pulled back into silence. The man's eyes burned into hers, then back to the rancher. His jaw worked, muscles straining, but he held the words inside for now. Instead, he turned, slamming his hand against the doorframe. The sharp crack echoed through the church. "This isn't finished," he spat, before stepping back into the night. His boots pounded against the dirt road outside until the sound faded into the distance. The widow sagged against the pew, her body trembling with the release of air she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The rancher stood firm, his hat still pressed against his chest, his eyes following the door as though expecting the man to return any moment. The preacher exhaled shakily, muttering a prayer under his breath. For a long while, no one spoke. The widow finally found her voice, though it was thin and ragged. "You shouldn't have stepped in," she whispered, not looking at him. The rancher turned his gaze on her, steady but softer now. "Shouldn't have? Or no one ever has." Her lips trembled, but she didn't answer. Instead, she rose slowly, cradling her child, and walked toward the door. The rancher followed, silent, until they both stood outside under the stretch of stars. The air was cool, the sky wide and endless, but the ground beneath them felt uncertain. In the days that followed, the town could feel the unease. The man's return stirred questions no one asked aloud, but everyone thought about. The widow kept to herself, working, tending her baby, keeping her cabin as much a fortress as she could manage. The rancher kept watch from a distance, his presence often near though not intrusive. He repaired fences, hauled supplies, rode the edges of his land, but his thoughts never strayed far from the widow and the storm circling her life. The man wasn't gone. Rumors spread of him being seen near the saloon, or riding toward the hills, or asking about debts owed. Each whisper grew sharper, like the town itself knew a reckoning was coming. Folks avoided speaking of it openly, but glances passed in the street, worry tightening around them like a rope. The widow's nights grew longer, her child often restless in her arms. Each creak of the cabin boards, each howl of the wind through the cracks, set her nerves alight. She feared not only the hunger that still lingered, but the past that seemed to stalk her from the shadows. She thought often of the rancher's words, his steady presence, but she fought herself not to lean on it. Trusting him meant opening the door to hope, and hope was something she wasn't sure she could survive if it failed her. The rancher, too, felt the pull of a choice that hadn't yet been made. He knew stepping deeper into her troubles might mean bringing them onto his own land, into his own life. But every time he remembered her voice in the store, trembling as she bartered her child's blanket for bread, the decision felt less like a choice and more like something already written in his bones. And so the days stretched, taut with unease, like a rope pulled tighter and tighter without snapping. Everyone knew it would break eventually, but no one knew when. The widow, the rancher, and the man who wouldn't let go of what he claimed to each of them moved closer to that breaking point with every passing hour. The widow. I stood one evening at her cabin door. the child asleep inside, watching the horizon glow faint with the last of the sun. Her chest ached with fear, but beneath it was something else, something she couldn't name. A restlessness, a trembling anticipation, as if the land itself was holding its breath. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew it would not let her go unchanged far off. The rancher saddled his horse beneath the rising moon, his eyes fixed on the dark stretch of hills where he suspected the man waited. His grip tightened on the reins, his jaw set. Whatever was coming, he wouldn't let her face it alone. And in the silence of the approaching night, the tension grew to its sharpest edge, leaving the question heavy in the air: who would stand? Who would fall? And what truths would finally come crashing down when the storm broke? The night was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that comes before a storm breaks. The widow lay in her cabin, her child asleep against her chest, but her own eyes refused to close. She could feel it, the weight of something about to end one way or another. Each creak of the boards, each whisper of wind against the walls, made her tighten her arms around the baby. She had lived through years of hardship, but nothing had ever felt as close, as pressing, as this moment. Out beyond the cabin, the rancher rode slowly along the edge of his land. His horse's hooves struck the dirt in steady rhythm, but his mind churned. He knew the man wasn't going to vanish into the hills quietly. A man like that carried his grudges like a second skin, and whatever claim he thought he had on the widow, he wasn't about to let go of it without a fight. The rancher pulled his coat tighter against the chill night air and fixed his eyes on the distant ridge. He wasn't a man who sought trouble, but trouble had already found its way into his path. It came before dawn, when the sky was still ink black and only the stars burned above. The sound of hooves broke the quiet first, faint, at a distance, then louder, sharper, until the echo reached the widow's cabin. She sat up, heart pounding, her baby stirring awake with a soft cry. She whispered comfort, though her own fear trembled in her voice. She knew without needing to look who it was. The rancher had already heard it too. He spurred his horse forward, closing the ground quickly, till he saw the shadow of a rider approaching the widow's place. He stopped short of the fence line, waiting, his figure hidden against the dark. He wanted to see first, to be sure. The man dismounted roughly, tying his horse near the widow's cabin door. His boots thudded against the earth, heavy, determined. He pounded once on the door, his voice cutting through the still night. "You can't keep shutting me out." The widow froze, her baby pressed against her shoulder, every part of her body trembling. She didn't answer, didn't move. The pounding came again, harder this time. "You owe me more than silence," he growled, before she could respond. Another sound broke across the yard, the measured step of boots. The rancher had moved forward now, his silhouette forming out of the shadows, his stance solid as the earth itself. His voice was steady, even, but carried the force of steel. "That's far enough." The man spun, his hand twitching near his belt, but he stopped when he saw who it was. His jaw tightened. "So you've decided to make this your business after all?" The rancher didn't flinch. "She told you she has nothing left to give. That should have been enough." The air between them crackled with tension. Two men standing not more than a few yards apart, both carrying more than words in their silence. The widow clutched her child and moved toward the window, her eyes darting between them. She didn't want violence, not for herself, not for her child, but she knew this night was the reckoning they'd all been circling. The man's voice dropped low, almost a hiss. "You don't understand? She left me with nothing. She turned her back when I needed her most." His eyes flashed toward the cabin, anger and bitterness tangled together. "Now she wants to walk away like it never happened." The widow's voice finally rose, cracking but fierce. She opened the door just enough to be heard, her child still held close. "You left yourself," she said, her words trembling but true. "You chose your path, and I chose mine. What I owe now is to my child, not to you." The man's face twisted, as if the words cut deeper than any blade. He stepped forward, but the rancher moved to block him, his hand firm on the brim of his hat. "She's not alone anymore," he said quietly, the weight of his tone making clear it wasn't just a warning, it was a vow. For a long moment, It seemed the man might push this night into blood and fire. His hand hovered near his side, his chest heaving. The widow's breath caught in her throat, the baby whimpering softly. But then the man's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had risen. He spat into the dirt, anger still burning in his eyes, but he stepped back. "This isn't worth it," he muttered. He mounted his horse with sharp movements, glancing once more toward the cabin. "But don't think you can bury the past with bread and kindness." With that, he turned and rode off into the fading night, his figure swallowed by the dark hills. The widow stood in the doorway, her body weak with the release of tension, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. She didn't know whether to be relieved or afraid of what might still come. The rancher turned toward her, his face unreadable, but his eyes steady on hers. "He won't come back," he said, though in truth he wasn't certain. But he meant it as much for her heart as for her safety. She nodded once, her throat too tight for words. Slowly, she stepped out, the first light of dawn creeping across the sky, painting the world in pale gold. She looked at the rancher, at the man who had stood in the gap for her without asking for anything in return. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. The rancher shook his head. "Don't need thanks. Just need you and the little one to have a fair chance." She swallowed hard, her arms tightening around her child. For the first time in a long time, she let herself breathe without the constant weight of fear pressing her down. The road ahead would still be hardship didn't vanish overnight, but she wasn't carrying it. It's entirely alone anymore. In the weeks that followed, the town slowly returned to its rhythm. The man was gone, no word of him reaching back to the valley. Some believed he'd left for good, chasing some other grudge down the trail. Others thought he might return one day, but fewer whispered it aloud. Life had enough burdens without feeding old fears. The widow began to find her footing again. With the rancher's quiet help, she mended her cabin, stocked more food, and found work that gave her a small but steady means to care for her child. She never asked for his help, but he offered it in ways that didn't weigh on her pride. A fence post mended here, a sack of grain left quietly by her door there. It was never more than she could accept, but always enough to remind her she wasn't forgotten. The rancher kept to his work, tending his land, but the widow and her child became part of the horizon he looked toward each day. He never pressed for more, never spoke words she wasn't ready to hear. He simply stayed steady, a presence that weathered storms and reminded her that life could hold both hardship and hope in the same breath. The townsfolk stopped whispering after a while. They saw the widow stand taller, her child thriving. And they saw the rancher close by, not as savior, but as neighbor, as someone who carried respect rather than pity. And in a place where survival often meant going it alone, there was something quietly powerful in that, as spring broke across the valley. The widow stood outside her cabin one morning, her child toddling now in the grass at her feet. The rancher rode up, tipping his hat in the soft sunlight. She met his eyes, and for the first time, her smile came without hesitation. Life wasn't easy, and it never would be, but it was life they could face together, without debts, without shadows. Only the land, the work, the sky above, and the quiet strength of knowing they were not alone. And so, the story of a widow who once traded her baby's blanket for bread ended not in despair, but in a lesson that lingered across the valley. That sometimes the simplest act's a hat laid on a table. A man standing silent at your side could change the weight of the world you carried. It wasn't about saving or being saved. It was about standing when no one else would. And finding hope in the space where kindness met courage, the widow lifted her child into her arms, the rancher dismounting nearby, and together they faced the wide horizon. The past no longer held them. The future, uncertain though it was, stretched open like the land itself, ready for whatever came next.